Hi, I'm Gil Roth, founder and president of the Pharma and Biopharma Outsourcing Association, or PBOA. I want to thank the FarmSource team for inviting me to speak at the inaugural CDMO Live event. I hope you have a productive meeting and learn a lot from these sessions. The PBOA is a nonprofit trade association that advocates for the regulatory, legislative, and general business interests of the CDMO sector. In layman's terms, that means we bring our member companies together to work with FDA, the U.S. Congress and White House, and their counterparts in other regions, while also creating an environment where CDMOs can talk with their peers, share best practices, ask questions, and otherwise interact in an antitrust compliant, non-collusive way. I'm registered as a lobbyist with the federal government, and PBOA also employs an advocacy firm in Washington to stay on top of what's happening on Capitol Hill. Today, I'm going to talk about legislative and executive policies coming out of Washington, how they may affect the CDMO sector, and how they might change or not change after the 2024 U.S. elections. Let me say at the outset, I will not be making any electoral predictions and will try to minimize the editorializing in favor of, explaining what we're seeing and what may come in 2025 and beyond. Frankly, you know as much as I do about what will happen this November. I also will not be commenting explicitly on the Inflation Reduction Act and Medicare price negotiations. At the beginning of every meeting I've ever had with congressional staff since we launched PBOA 10 years ago, I always let them know CDMOs are not involved in drug pricing. We just help the license holders develop and manufacture their products. Pricing is beyond our pay grade. I will say that if the Medicare negotiation program continues and if it has the predicted by some effect of reducing R&D investment, then yes, that would potentially impact the CDMO sector, just as an R&D funding drought has created strains in the sector in recent years. But I'll also note that the previous president proposed a price control program for pharmaceuticals centered on international reference pricing as opposed to Medicare negotiations, so both candidates have made a campaign point about drug prices. The current administration has implemented that, we'll say. So, with that out of the way, the CDMO sector has been higher on the U.S. government's radar since the pandemic and the success of Operation Warp Speed, of course. The feds worked closely not just with developers of vaccines and therapeutics through OWS, but with the CDMOs who were making those products for them. And in the process, they really learned about our industry's ecosystem, along with the intricacies of our supply chains, both their relative robustness and, at times, fragility. And in a sense, supply chains and supply chain transparency has been a key policy area of the U.S. government in recent years, both the executive branch and the legislative. So, during the initial phase of the pandemic in the previous administration in 2020, Congress passed a massive COVID relief bill called the CARES Act, which included statute giving FDA authority to mandate reporting amounts from industry. FDA's implementation of that authority has been, flawed, as it's tried to compel every manufacturing facility, both API and finished dosage, and both CDMO and in-house, to annually report the volume of each product they make. After a few reporting cycles, FDA told Congress it's gotten responses, I believe, from about half of the facilities in its inventory, impairing its goal of better understanding the supply chain in terms of individual sites' production. On the strength of that, the agency is now lobbying Congress to grant it even more reporting authority, to compel drug makers to publish sourcing information on drug product labels, and to get dosage form sites, again, both CDMO and in-house, to report the source of and volume of every API they receive to the FDA. The utility of that is debatable, and there seems to be a fairly partisan split in terms of whether to grant that sort of authority, with Democrats endorsing this expansion and Republicans more skeptical. A shift in Congress thus could lead to an increase in the reporting burden and costs for CDMOs. But at a recent congressional hearing with the heads of CDER, CBER, and CDRH, Republican representatives showed less trust in providing more authority to FDA, instead focusing more on the agency's own reporting and accountability, both for its internal operations and its user fee obligations, which we'll talk about a little later. But the understanding of drug supply chains, it's intertwined with the growing concept of reshoring the manufacture of drugs and vaccines, particularly essential medicines, as they're known from a 2020 list that was produced through HHS. PBOA has been involved in discussions about reshoring and onshoring even before the pandemic, as various congressional committees tried to get a handle on what's made where and how we can protect the supply of drugs for patients in the U.S. Since the pandemic and its attendant export bans and the facility and regional shutdowns that occurred, the topic's become even more pointed. As various groups have studied the issue, we've seen more interest from both Democrats and Republicans in a blend of reshoring and friendshoring, or sourcing ingredients and services from allied, non-adversarial countries. And a PBOA has been involved in many meetings and consultations on this topic, helping educate regulators and legislators as to what the current landscape looks like, what manufacturing is already present in the U.S. or in some of these allied countries, and what ingredients and services may be difficult to move and why. And I've been, I'll say, gratified to see that the Republican-led House of Representatives this term has been quite realistic about the prospects of shifting supplies not solely to the U.S. They seem to understand the limits and timeframes of an industrial retrenching that would bring APIs, excipients, and key starting materials to the U.S. Instead, they've looked more to, again, allied countries and trusted partners. Potential changes in the White House and Congress could affect that equation, but it's clear that the U.S. and other regions are exploring a number of routes to try to improve or, we'll say, bolster their supply chains. In some cases, that involves industrial policy or significant federal investment in key sectors. For example, in the U.S., the CHIPS Act created massive funding to build computer chip facilities here, extending grants and loans to the private sector. There's been some talk of a biopharma version of this, but again, a change in administrations could scuttle that sort of concept or see it go in another direction. Although, again, other countries are also engaged in trying to fund this sort of domestic manufacturing base, either to replace some of the current supply chains or at least to provide backups to them. The PBOA has discussed the CDMO landscape with the previous administration and the current one, explaining what sorts of facilities and capacities already exist in the U.S. and our allies and where investment could be spent. For example, as the chips industry is discovering, building facilities here will only take you so far without an investment in workforce development. And getting congressional buy-in for long-term educational programs in key industries can be an uphill climb. And the educational system, frankly, has become a fraught culture war topic that I'd really rather not wade into. So instead, I'm going to talk about a less controversial topic, the U.S. relationship with China. So, perhaps the most significant policy regarding supply chains and CDMOs has been 2024's BioSecure Act, which is currently working its way through both houses of Congress. The BioSecure Act is intended to protect Americans' multinomic data from being passed along to foreign adversaries. In principle, it bars companies from contracting with the U.S. government if they're also doing business with a company of concern in the biotech space. The BioSecure Bill names 5 specific companies: BGI, MGI, Complete Genomics, WuXi AppTech, and WuXi Biologics, and also creates criteria for other companies to be added to the list. The situation around BioSecure is very complex and fast-moving. When the bill was introduced early in 2024, reprising a statute that was removed from the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, its prospects, frankly, seemed dim. But it gained momentum extremely quickly and looks likely to be passed in this year's NDAA in some way, shape, or form. And despite the bill's origins in the Republican-heavy House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, it's gained bipartisan support in key House and Senate committees. The present version, and again, this may change by the time you view this session, but I'm recording this in late May of 2024, the present version gives companies a deadline of January 1st, 2032 to cease working with those aforementioned 5 firms, and 5 years to cease working with any additional companies from the time they're put on the list. The present version also defines a contracting relationship in a way that seems to exclude companies that sell drugs to the Medicare program, but does not exclude those that sell into the Veterans Administration or the Department of Defense. So any company selling to those programs would need to decouple from those aforementioned companies. So if Biosecure becomes law, as currently written, companies that engage in those U.S. contracts will need to cease working with the Wuxi CDMOs and the other firms over the next 7+ years, barring a waiver from HHS. Now, such a move and the open-ended nature of the bill can be interpreted as a shot across the bow regarding use of Chinese CDMOs and other suppliers. And when it comes to how the 2024 election could affect that bill, I'm going to read you a quote from Biogen's CEO, Chris Viehbacher. Just happened a week or so ago at an event on this sort of topic. Chris said, "I don't think it's going to matter which administration wins in November on this subject. I think we're seeing an increasing East-West divide, and we have to be careful, because regardless of what you might think a Chinese company does with data, the fact is that we could have barriers to access people and equipment." And I think he's right about this. And it's a larger point about the current administration and the previous one. They both frame China as an adversary, and there's no reason to think that will change following the 2024 election, regardless of who wins the presidency. Now, there were reports and rumors about why the Biosecure Act gained escape velocity so quickly, but I won't go into those here. What I will say is that I think it carries a more serious threat/promise of decoupling with China more than tariffs or TikTok bans. And there may be massive ramifications to such an approach, and it's critical for CDMOs to be aware of what's happening and the role they can play in making sure that R&D pipelines and manufacturing supplies aren't disrupted. But they're not standing alone here. They're in a matrix with license holders, regulators, payers, and other bodies. So part of what PBOA does is inform our members about these developments and try to make sure they know what's going on in a way they can respond to them. But we also have a role in talking to Congress about the CDMO landscape, providing them with feedback about the practical aspects of rethinking the supply chain. And frankly, just like Mr. Viehbacher says, I don't see that changing after this fall's election, no matter what the makeup of the government. We're going into a new world, I think. We'll see how things change. I did not see this coming when the bill first was reintroduced in January. To be frank, one of my members said, "What do you make of it?" I said, it's not going to pass, but it's going to move the window on what gets discussed when it comes to China. And things, as I said, change in a hurry. Now, that said, there are other areas where the next administration and or the composition of both houses of Congress may affect the CDMO sector. I'll note that the Biden administration has been more active in investigating merger and acquisition proposals in the healthcare sector than the previous administration has been. The CDMO sector, as those of you who are inside it know, is very much driven by private equity firms. M&A activity is a key aspect of how these companies evolve. Right now, we're seeing a major acquisition taking place or having been proposed of a large pharma company acquiring a major CDMO. A change at the White House could lead to a more M&A friendly approach by the Federal Trade Commission. You could always ask AT&T and Time Warner. They might disagree with that sentiment based on their experience in the previous administration. But anyway, there might be easier time with M&A. The other major area where a change or, well, a change in administration could have an impact is the major FDA user fee programs. Those cover innovator drugs through PDUFA, generic drugs through GDUFA, biosimilars, BSUFA, and medical devices, MDUFA. Those all come due for negotiation simultaneously. They're 5-year reauthorizations during the next administration. Now, the UFAs, as they're known, the User Fee Act programs, they provide billions in funding to the FDA in exchange for commitments and goals from the agency regarding review times for drug applications and other agreed upon priorities. So the user fees involve industry paying into FDA or into the federal government, which gets dispersed to FDA, and FDA works to achieve the goals they negotiate with industry. Either candidate could have an influence on those negotiations, instructing FDA and HHS on certain positions or funding goals for these the next round of UFAs, as they're known. In theory, and this is just a hypothetical, the next administration could push for a higher foreign differential. That's the amount currently charged to every non-U.S. API and finished dosage form in the generic drug user fee program, or GDUFA. That currently stands at $15,000 per facility per year. The FDA, in theory, again, this is all hypothetical, could propose a much higher amount in order to incentivize domestic manufacturing. That sort of move could also invite blowback from other countries and the World Trade Organization. It could be something that industry rejects in the course of negotiations, but it's a way that a new administration or the current one could impact how user fees are negotiated going forward. And it's an example of policy that would ultimately affect the CDMO sector. Now, I'll note the user fee programs do have to be put into law by Congress after that negotiation between FDA and industry. And while Congress tends to accept the terms of the agreements between those parties and all these different UFAs, there is precedent for them to make changes somewhat unilaterally in consultation with industry, I bet. But it's extremely rare, but it has occurred. So there are checks and balances when it comes to this, but there are also most precedents are to respect how the user fees get negotiated. All of which is to say, there's a lot of uncertainty for the pharma industry overall around how the U.S. elections will go. The CDMO sector may be buffeted by second and third tier effects. There may be things that directly impact how CDMOs operate, depending on decisions made by the next administration and the next Congress. But CDMOs have proved their resilience in very trying times, including the recent pandemic crisis. PBOA has helped CDMOs better understand and influence government policy, and we continue to work with our members to make sure their voice is heard and that this sector has a seat at the table. I'm Gil Roth. Thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great experience at CDMO Live.